which have shaken the history of mankind.
The greatest leap forward in speed ever made by man. This is great.
Mathieu Barrault is an engineer and a teacher of mechanical engineering. He'll be following in the footsteps of pioneers and inventors, capable of overcoming formidable technological challenges to build increasingly powerful locomotives. A scientific investigation hot on the tracks of stubborn visionaries driven by the ambition to become the masters of rail. In the fog of England, deep in the Iron Bridge Gorge, Mathieu Barrault's investigation begins. This old mining region was once the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, and amid the upheavals of the 19th century, welcomed Richard Trevithick, a brilliant engineer from Cornwall, who, with blast furnaces spewing smoke in the background, forged the cogs and shafts of an astonishing engine, with little idea of how it would go on to change technology and human life forever.
Wow.
Incredible machine.
Hello.
Hi, Alan.
Hello, Mathieu. Bonjour. Elle est extraordinaire.
Your machine is extraordinary. I was watching it from across the river. It's amazing. I love the mixture of giant cogs, steam and smoke.
Yes, it's the first steam engine ever to run on a rail. So every steam engine came after it were designed around it, but this was the very first one.
Great. And how does it work?
Well, the fire is under there. You have a boiler with water in it. When the fire gets hot enough, it converts the water into steam.
And that's what drives the engine. Can we try?
Yes, certainly, yes.
It's awesome. The steam and everything. It's just awesome.
That's why the people were frightened of it when they first saw it.
Ah, yeah.
Oh, all the steam.
Ouais, on comprend pourquoi.
You can imagine why.
Ça grogne.
Groaning and spitting out steam like a huge monster.
Vapeur.
It's like a dragon.
Ça, c'est pour...
And is that to control the steam?
This is for putting the steam onto the piston. So the more steam you put on, the faster you go. It's like an accelerator in a car.
The boiler of a steam locomotive consists of a firebox where coal is burned. The hot smoke from the fire enters a U-shaped tube, the smoke box, immersed in a tank of water. When the water boils, it turns into steam, which then enters an airtight chamber, the cylinder. The pressure generated by the steam exerts force on a piston and sets it in motion. When the piston stops, a second inverted system sends steam into the cylinder. The piston therefore keeps moving backwards and forwards, pulling the crank, an articulated shaft which transmits movement to the wheels. The more steam and the more pressure there is, the more power and speed is generated for the locomotive. Trevithick was the heir of James Watt, the renowned Scottish engineer, whose work on steam had already led to the invention of tools, which could produce far more, and far more quickly, than humans or animals.
What speed could Trevithick's engine reach?
Well, there's no... So that's all he wanted to do. So we assumed that his engine would do 4 miles per hour.
How do we stop it?
There's no brakes.
No brakes.
You must be very careful, let it stop under its own weight. Okay?
Georgina, when you see this strange machine,
There were problems with the wheels and he crashed into a wall.
The uncertain steering of the machine hindered its performance. So Trevithick had the bright and, in the end, obvious idea of using rails, which had long been employed in the transport of heavy loads. He built a new prototype with new wheels and simply placed it on some coal mine tracks. And thus, the first train in history was born.
So on the morning of February 21st, 1804, a large crowd had gathered to watch this locomotive. There were 70 passengers on it. It had 5 wagons with 10 tons of iron, and it took something like 4 hours to travel 9 miles, but they did it, and at the finish line, there was a large crowd there to cheer them on.
so much time for only 15 kilometres. Pretty wheezy. But a huge revolution in transport. It must have been his hour of glory.
No, not really. Sadly, fame and fortune never came to Trevithick. On the same day, the return journey of that locomotive, the bolts broke, the boiler flooded. But in 1808, Trevithick built another locomotive. This was called Catch Me Who Can, and it ran successfully for a few weeks.
Trevithick opened his steam circus on a fenced-off circular track in London, where passengers could take short rides on this new locomotive for 1 shilling. But the weight of the engine broke one of the brittle cast iron rails, causing a derailment.
The idea of putting a steam engine on rails was too far ahead of his time, because the right metal hadn't been invented yet. A pity, because he had all the ingredients to start a real revolution.
He really had quite a sad history, but he made railways a practical proposition.
The secret of rail is the contact between the steel wheels and the steel track, meaning very little energy is needed to move extremely heavy loads. Steel is a material which is very tough, so it's hard for it to deform. And the contact surface between wheel and rail is very small. This means there is low friction, which is very specific to rail, and this can't be matched by vehicles with rubber tires.
While Trevithick had the smart idea of using the wheel-rail combination, his knowledge of steam remained underdeveloped.
Trevithick's problem was the lack of power. His boiler was basically a cauldron, and a cauldron can't produce enough steam.
Producing almighty steam. That became the next great quest for the first masters of rail. And it was in France that a crucial invention would propel the railroad into a new era.
It's really impressive. Compared to Trevithick's machine, this is on a whole new scale.
This powerful engine was the invention of Marc Seguin. This remarkable engineer, a descendant of the Montgolfier brothers, who was convinced that new modes of transport would thrust his central heat exchange surface between fire and water, producing a lot more steam and thus boosting the engine's power.
The revolutionary multi-tube boiler would last until the end of steam traction. It was still used on the last locomotives in service in the 1970s, because no one had ever found anything better.
Marc Seguin had had a flash of genius when designing his boiler. But the subtleties of mechanical transmission remained beyond his grasp.
Marc Seguin's locomotive was an archaic locomotive, even when he built it, because it lost too much energy in the transmission of movement by the connecting rods, which worked vertically. It was the British mining engineer, George Stephenson, who would invent what can be called the modern locomotive, his famous rocket. On the rocket, the cylinders were laid almost flat, and instead of vertical connecting rods, the cylinders worked directly on the wheels with jointed cranks. This was much simpler and much more rational. And at the Rainhill trials in 1829, he reached 59 kilometers per hour and won the contest. It was the fastest speed ever achieved by simply opening a tap on a machine.
An unprecedented achievement which fascinated many, but worried a few.
Adolphe Thiers, who was Minister of Public Works at the time, claimed that at speeds of 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, the human body would decompose. So he was formally against such speeds.
But irrational fears like this wouldn't stand in the way of the railroad revolution.
Before the existence of the railroad, land travel didn't have fixed times. Stagecoach companies told passengers, "We leave at daybreak." People saw sun up and said, "Oh, it's time to go catch my coach." Departure times were extremely vague. But the railroad would impose very precise times for management and safety reasons. The railroad began to punctuate life to such an extent that the station clock replaced the church clock as the reference for time.
Unifying regions, linking them together and creating a country. That was another role of the railroads. The United States of America. A massive challenge for the fledgling railroad. And it gave rise to a golden age of the railroad and the birth of the American nation. Denver, Colorado. Makes a long, slow climb through the freezing mists of the Rocky Mountains. A first view of the continent's geographical diversity. The California Zephyr follows the route taken by the 49ers, the pioneers of the mid-19th century gold rush. It took them 4 to 5 months to cross from east to west in terrifying conditions. Fighting off the cold, threatened by attacks from Native Americans, and at the mercy of hunger and disease. Thousands of them died along the way.
And ladies and gentlemen, just for your information, those going to Roseville, that stop will be
Zephyr, to get a taste of what life on rails was like in the old days.
It's beautiful. It's a really, really big room, and you'd never expect to see such a big table in a rail car.
It's exactly the way it was when they put it on the rails the first time in 1923. The President of the United States had a car like this. Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, this is the exact type of car they would have used.
Rail cars with a platform, mobile stages perfect for crisscrossing this vast country during a presidential campaign.
I don't think you can really understand the country unless you see how big it is. And if you take a train from Chicago to San Francisco Bay, you see out there what a big place this is. And you see some of it, like we're going through right now, there's nobody there. And this is cowboy country. And it hasn't changed in 150 years. To understand the country, it's a good way to see it.
After a journey of more than 40 hours, the Zephyr finally reaches its destination, California.
Welcome to Amtrak at Sacramento Station. Attention, please secure all.
Sacramento, the state capital. An emblematic city in the development of the railroads in the United States. The departure point for one of the most incredible human and technological adventures ever, the first transcontinental railroad.
Well, the railroad is fundamental to the growth of America in the 19th century. It's every bit as important as man landing on the moon was 100 years later. And starting with probably the very first day that railroads arrived, people began talking about building railroads from the east coast of the United States to the west coast of the continent. Building a railroad across that required not only engineers to design and develop new ways of doing things and to make new kinds of equipment, but also people to do things that were logically thought to be impossible. It really is a remarkable story.
To fulfill this crazy ambition, in 1862, on the request of Abraham Lincoln, the US Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act in order to create the longest railroad in the world. A gigantic challenge in a country torn by the War of Secession.
When I got to the station, I noticed a huge mural depicting the groundbreaking of the railroad in Sacramento.
Yes, that's one of my favorite murals, and it depicts the groundbreaking on January 9th, 1863, that began the Transcontinental Railroad. But did you know that that actual event happened right on this spot?
Right here?
Right here, yeah.
It's really moving to be in the very spot. But why did it all start here?
Sacramento is the state
After the gold rush, 4 men, wholesaler Leland Stanford, iron forger Charles Crocker, and general store owners Collis Huntington and Mark Hopkins, joined forces to found the Central Pacific Railroad Company. Known as the Big Four, this band of battle-hardened entrepreneurs gambled on the Transcontinental Railroad, bringing them fame and fortune. But it would be impossible to see this titanic project through without an army of experienced laborers.
When the railroad was beginning construction, they quickly ran out of workers for a couple of reasons. One was that a lot of white men left Sacramento to go fight in the Civil War back in the eastern United States. And so there was a shortage of white workers. But those that were left found that this work was very, very hard. It didn't pay as well as they wanted to, like anyone, to get gold. But because of the discrimination of Chinese and the laws and general attitudes toward Chinese, they couldn't have many jobs. So Leland Stanford had this idea given to him, and he said, I don't want to hire Chinese. But Charlie Crocker said, well, wait a minute, they built the Great Wall of China. I think they can help build a railroad. And they agreed to take Chinese on for an experiment to see if it would work. Within a couple of weeks, they found out that the Chinese were wonderful workers. They worked very hard. They worked long, hard hours. They worked for less money than white workers would work, and they were very loyal.
The contingent of laborers on the Central Pacific Railroad proved to be incredibly efficient, and the laying of the tracks progressed at a frenetic rate. Nothing seemed to stand in the way of the Big Four's ambitions, except perhaps nature herself. Just 100 kilometers from Sacramento stood a daunting, supposedly uncrossable obstacle: the steep slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountain range.
We're going to come up to about 7,000 feet. The snow here is some of the deepest in North America. This is part of what is called the Sierra Nevada batholith, this giant mountain of granite that rises out of the earth.
Phil Sexton and Mathieu Barrault are heading to the top of the Donner Pass, a spot etched in the American collective memory for the tragedy that occurred there in 1847. A group of pioneers heading to California on foot found the pass blocked by snow and was forced to spend a particularly harsh winter there. Half of them never made it out, and some of the survivors even resorted to cannibalism.
This is the pass. So what do you think of crossing the pass here? You are now entering the Great Basin of the United States. So you're now on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada.
The Donner Pass, as hostile as it is strikingly beautiful.
It's grandiose, amazing. I can't help thinking as an engineer, it's totally crazy to build a railroad through here.
Crazy is a good description of building a railroad through this country, but it also fits the man who had it built. The man who surveyed this route was known as Crazy Judah because of his single-minded determination to find a railroad route over the Sierra Nevada. People called him crazy because that's really all he would talk about as he wandered through town. And he kept pitching his idea, he kept writing descriptions, he kept coming into the mountains and exploring these routes. But eventually he drew up plans and he found backers who helped him form the Central Pacific Railroad Company to help make his dream come true.
Was there no other route from east to west, apart from this one?
There were other routes surveyed, but this was the best route because it really is the smoothest route, which is really important for railroads because railroads are limited to a 2.5% grade. That is 2.5 meters and 100 meters.
Yes, that's the flip side of the coin of the wheel-rail contact. It was a genius invention because there's very little friction, so you can pull very heavy loads with little power. But at the same time, you lose in locomotion.
When you're building a railroad through the mountains, or really any road through the mountains, you can either go around them or you can go through them. But railroads, unlike wagons, cannot turn sharp and constantly. They have gentle curves they need to meet. So the answer here was to do tunnels. And there are 13 tunnels between Emigrant Gap and the summit. And right here, there's a group of tunnels that's very, very interesting. From here, there is Tunnel 6, and then Tunnel 7, Tunnel 8, Tunnel 9, and then so on and so forth, all the way down to Truckee is a series of tunnels and snow sheds because that allows the curve and the grade to be exactly right for a railroad. And it's just a perfect line.
But piercing through the heart of the mountains was a tall order. In protest at their appalling working conditions, the Chinese laborers called a strike. In retaliation, Charles Crocker deprived them of food, forcing them back to work. In this railroad race to the east, the goal became the very means of the conquest. Materials were transported as
I love the colours of these locomotives. This one's like a giant toy train with chrome everywhere.
Wanted to be showy and show them off. But also the engineers who operated this equipment, they were assigned a particular engine. They didn't own it, but it was theirs, and they polished and they customized their locomotives.
Another thing that surprises me as an engineer are these small wheels at the front. What were they for?
The large wheel, and you can see it's connected to the drive shaft, is what powers the locomotive and makes it move forward or backwards. The two wheel sets in front and the two wheel sets in back are called bogies, and they are actually flexible.
bogies are small trolleys with 4 wheels. Placed at the front and rear of the engine, they provide a more even spread of the locomotive's mass on the rails. They're also fitted onto each wagon or rail car. As free rolling units, the bogies are mobile compared to the chassis, thanks to a pivot placed in the center. So as the train comes into a bend, the bogies move successively towards its center, enabling the train to take the bend smoothly and with stability.
This is really important in the early days of railroading because much rail, particularly in the race to build the Transcontinental Railroad, was poorly laid. It was uneven, it was bumpy, it was sometimes not completely parallel, and it was sometimes wavy. And by having these flexible wheels that would hang with the track, it would help keep the trains on track. But even today, there are important safety measures for modern
company, Union Pacific, also joined the venture, starting from the east of the states. They began laying their railroad track in Omaha, Nebraska, earning the city its nickname of Gateway to the West. A former Union Army officer, Grenville Mellon Dodge, took charge of a new army, this time of laborers, made up of Irish immigrants, freed slaves, and Civil War veterans. But while the vast plains of Nebraska were perfect for laying flat track, Union Pacific would encounter other difficulties.
The biggest problem for the Union Pacific was the concept of hell on wheels towns. The towns were shacks and tents that were carried to the end of track on flat cars, and then they would erect temporary cities at the end of track. And these were places of incredible violence and immorality. They had gambling houses, they had saloons, they had houses of ill repute with beautiful women, but they were very, very violent and very profane. So for every worker that was killed in accident building the railroad, about 4 people were killed or injured in those hell on wheels towns. But the other big issue facing the Union Pacific was the Indians, the Native Americans who had lived on this land for thousands of years. And the natives were frustrated, so they tried attacking the trains. The railroad for the Indians was part of the irretrievable change in the continent. It destroyed their native ways of life and changed their ways of life forever.
In 1869, the rival tracks from the east and from the west met up. But the companies, lured by the prospects of huge profits, continued their work alone and in parallel. This absurd situation was finally brought to an end when President Ulysses S. Grant demanded that the 2 railroads be joined together in the heart of Utah at a spot called Promontory Summit.
Well, this is the famous photo of the laying of the last spike of the railroad. And you notice that the engineers are on the front of the locomotive, each with bottles, and on the left side is water from the Pacific Ocean, on the right side is water from the Atlantic, and this joined the 2 oceans by a ribbon of iron rail. They had one section of rail that had not been laid, and they brought in a special crew of Chinese workers because of all of their hard work to lay these last 2 rails and bolt them in place. And they set up a ceremony that involved a golden spike. That's the symbol of America coming together. And what it did was it joined the nation together from the east to the west, and it made America genuinely a transcontinental nation. What had been a 4-month journey by wagon across the continent or a 6-month journey around the tip of South America by boat became 10 to 12 days and quickly became 8 days as rail travel continued. It put America in motion.
Europe also had its transcontinental ambitions. Trains journeyed from capital to capital, pulled by increasingly powerful locomotives, spewing out great clouds of steam and smoke across the vast plains of the old continent. And the queen of these puffing dragons was the Pacific 231. 6 years old, this rare locomotive, listed as a historical monument in France, testifies to the work of engineer André Chapelon, known worldwide as the genius of French steam.
It looks like the door of a safe.
Well, let's crack the safe.
Steam whose recipe lies behind the heavy door of the smokebox.
So, explain the setup. What's in the middle of the smokebox?
It's the exhaust hatch for the steam once it's done its job in the cylinders. It's what makes the steam locomotive's famous choo-choo. And it's also through here that the smoke and hot gases from the firebox are released.
And this is the extractor?
That's right. When the steam is released, it sucks out the hot gases from the firebox with it.
So it increases and improves the steam. And what's this?
What you see here are smoke tubes.
Ah, like on the Marc Séguin boiler.
Exactly.
There's something different, though. These tubes, entering the smoke tubes.
These are called superheaters.
Through these tubes, the freshly produced steam passes into the boiler and rises in temperature to 350 degrees Celsius. Freed of the least droplet of water, this dry steam produces unprecedented power.
After adding these improvements, locomotives with a horsepower of 2,300 increased in horsepower to 3,500. And even more fantastic, they use 20% less water and 15% less coal.
That's remarkable. A better performance from less.
Exactly.
To bring this exceptional engine back to life, Alain and the other enthusiasts of the Pacific Steam Club have been working tirelessly for almost 10 years. A venture about to conclude with the first heating up of the Pacific.
Impressive sparks.
For sure. We are ready to roll her out for the first time.
We'll see if she starts up. Rolling.
She sure is. Fantastic. Here's a reward for 10 years of hard work.
Before the inevitable happened.
It was a very greedy engine, and coal was very expensive. It was also labour-intensive, as it needed 2 men on board. And it took a full 8 hours of work to heat it up before it could even get going, so people began to question steam.
After World War II, steam began a slow decline in the face of competition from diesel locomotives and the development of electric propulsion.
Electrification came with a high early cost because the infrastructures were expensive. But this cost was soon written off due to the flexibility of electric locomotive fleets and the fact that you just switched them on and they went, unlike all the time needed to heat up a steam engine.
But the electric revolution wasn't enough to perpetuate the train's reign over the world of transport.
For transport inside France, there were suddenly the new motorways, so cars on concrete, and domestic airlines with planes that were comfortable, more modern and faster. So the railway authorities became discouraged. Rail seemed to have no future. But the TGV would change all that.
Having first launched research into development into a turbo train fitted with a helicopter turbine, the succession of oil crises led the SNCF design teams to work definitively on electric propulsion. One option was to follow in the wake of the Japanese Shinkansen, the precursor of very high-speed rail travel in 1964. The TGV program was launched. Soon, prototypes had passed the 300 kilometers an hour mark. From September 1981, French people could travel from Paris to Lyon in 2 hours 40 minutes, compared to the 4 hours before. The TGV laid the foundations for a new concept in railroad engineering. Its articulated train, topped and tailed by 2 engines, one pulling, the other pushing, and its aerodynamic finesse would make the TGV a pride of French engineering and industry. The TGV is the perfect synthesis of state-of-the-art technology and proven mechanics. Its wheels are slightly conical, nearly identical to those on the early locomotives. On a curve, the bend radius of the outer rail is greater than that of the inner rail. So the distance travelled by the outer wheel on the axle is greater than that travelled by the inner wheel. But the two wheels on an axle turn at the same speed, so this difference must be compensated for to prevent the train from derailing. For this, a simple solution was found: to make the wheels slightly conical. Therefore, on a bend, when centrifugal force pushes the train outwards, the outer wheel rises onto the same axle. On April the 3rd, 2007, the TGV set a new passenger train world speed record of 574.8 kilometers an hour. An exceptional performance accomplished by a TGV specially configured for the occasion, with larger wheels and a shortened train. In the space of 2 centuries, rail speed has multiplied by 100. A crazy pace helped on by all-round excellence in civil engineering. Thus, the Channel Tunnel, inaugurated in 1994 with its 50 kilometers, 38 of which are sub-sea, means that now only 20 minutes separate Britain.
We've just entered the longest tunnel in the world. Naturally, the view will get a bit boring.
It's marvelous. It's a bit like being in a science fiction film, going through these straight tunnels.
And the temperature of the rock at this depth is above 50 degrees Celsius. So at that point, the temperature in the tunnel is just over 40 degrees.
40 degrees?
Yes, 40 degrees.
And that's due to the 2,300 meters of rock overhead acting as insulation.
That's right.
No need for more.
No, the insulation's good, and there's no snow either.
Starting in the north of the Swiss Alps and ending in the south, the Gotthard Base Tunnel consists of 2 single-track tubes linked every 325 meters by connecting galleries. This structure makes each section an isolated space and is a solution for evacuation in case of fire.
We're approaching the south portal. Then we'll see what the weather's like in Ticino, whether it's fine or cloudy like it was in the north. There's light at the end of the tunnel.
Wow, it's amazing. Incredible. You not only pass through a mountain, but go from one region to another, one weather to another.
Welcome to Ticino.
Inaugurated in June 2016, the longest rail tunnel in the world took 17 years to construct, 10 of which were dedicated solely to boring through the mountains with the project's outsized moles. 28 million tons of rubble were excavated in the boring of the twin tunnels' combined 114 kilometers, plus the connecting and maintenance access galleries. Now, early in the 21st century, all the ingredients of rail science seem to have been discovered. Is it possible for the train to progress even further?
If you were to ask me what a train would look like in 2080 or 2100, I'd say, I'll show you. And you'd probably be surprised. I'd take you to the Gare du Nord and show you today's Thalys or today's Eurostar. These trains will still be rolling in 50, 60 years. Rail in 60 years' time will be the same as today. For the train to evolve, there'd have to be a huge technological break from the current wheel and rail system.
In Japan, the 600 kilometers an hour barrier was recently broken by a new maglev technology prototype.
The term maglev is derived from magnetic and levitation. It's a train that uses electrodynamic suspension.
The SC maglev is a train fitted with powerful electromagnets the length of its chassis. All along the U-shaped guidance track are other electromagnets whose poles can be interchanged. Switching from one pole to the other means the train is alternately tracted and repelled by the track, thus creating propulsion. The faster the polar switch, the faster the train goes. At 150 kilometers an hour, the train's rubber-tired wheels retract, since the magnetic field generated by the maglev as it passes levitates the train to a height of 10 centimeters. But this state-of-the-art technology is so new, it will require huge amounts of investment.
To deploy this system, you'd need very high cost optimization.
Cannot escape the laws of physics. Air friction increases considerably, meaning powerful and energy-intensive propulsion.
To solve the problem of aerodynamic drag, the big temptation is to have trains traveling inside a tube in which a total vacuum, or at least a partial vacuum, is created. That's pretty much the principle behind the Hyperloop.
The Hyperloop is a project dreamed up by the billionaire entrepreneur and engineer Elon Musk. Tests have been carried out since May 2017 in the desert in Nevada. And the first 1,200 kilometers an hour passenger journeys should be possible in less than 5 years' time.
Hyperloop is straight out of Jules Verne. It's tomorrow's world. It opens up new possibilities because you might be able to travel 600 kilometers in half an hour. And with all the advantages of a train, rapid boarding, city center to city center, combined with the speed of a plane. So, if it works, it's really promising for travelers.
A promise worthy of perpetuating the very special charm of a bicentenary adventure.
The world of rail is a world through the looking glass. It's Alice in Wonderland. When you enter a train station, you enter a parallel universe. Taking a train, even a humble suburban train, is a huge adventure.
Train travel is never ordinary. There's a wonderful line in a poem by Guillaume Apollinaire. Fear that someday a train may no longer move you. It sums up perfectly all the magic of rail that's so hard to grasp. There are still plenty of people who can't help stopping to watch a train go by.